Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Right Side, aka Hegelborg. She's an Anon on Twitter. I've had her on before. She's in her early 20s, just graduated, and is about to take the bar. And in this conversation, we talk about her philosophical explorations of the left, which, from her point of view, comes through Hegel via a whole bunch of Kabalistic literature and Gnosticism. We get into that. It's kind of heady. And then we get into her newfound appreciation of Orthodox Christianity and how she believes that only a Christian ethic internalized by a populace can support a pluralistic democracy. You can find her work via the links below, as well as tip jars. If you decide you want to support this channel, please like, subscribe. Without further ado, here is a Right Side. Where are you at now, politically?
I'm right wing, but amorphously right wing.
Okay. The right is got a kind of interesting right now because there's just so many people have been shoved out of the left or jumped out of the left or realized they weren't in the left anymore. And then they land in this place that's not the left that we don't have words for, so we just call the right.
Populist, right?
Okay.
Approximately, probably.
You're populist? What do you think your role is? Educator? Activist?
Well, truthfully, I've been using Twitter as like basically like a punching bag, like a political punching bag, because the amount I can express my viewpoints in class is limited. Although I do it, but really, I've what I've noticed is I've been the only one, so it's kind of it has to be toned down a bit.
Hmm. Do people connect with you privately and say, you're really brave, I agree with you?
Yeah, I've had people do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It makes me kind of angry, but whatever.
Yeah. What can we do? I mean, you're on the normalizing end. How radical do you think you are? How based?
Like from who, like who's judging?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, how much power do people have to silence you because your ideas can be construed as toxic, hateful, dangerous, scary?
Well, now the power they have is likely reporting me to the bar, but
Hmm.
I my name's not out there, just my face. I've been relatively careful about that. Just so, because it's a lot harder to remove you from the bar than it is to deny you
Yeah.
admission. So that's pretty much it right now. But I
Yeah.
mean, I really haven't had many problems with it. But I think the blowback people think they're gonna get is a lot more overblown than in reality. And I think that's part of the mechanism is like have a like fear monger and kind of overblow slight dissent so to discourage dissent.
Yeah.
And then but if you do, they really can't do that much to you.
Mhm. Do you have faith in our legal system?
Uh define define legal system, like civil, criminal, the entire thing.
Well, I mean, I guess you're putting your eggs in that as a career, but it seems kind of fraught right now because I don't know. Do you agree that it's become irreparably politicized?
I think it's been irreparably politicized for a long time.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the kernel of that politicization?
Marbury v. Madison.
Okay,
Well,
Marbury.
Marbury v. Madison. It basically gave the judiciary powers of judicial review, it was like one of the first Supreme Court cases.
Oh, way back
Yeah,
when. Okay.
yeah. Because what if essentially is that allowed for um the judiciary to interpret legislation in a way that was independent of intent, and that enabled legislation from the bench.
Okay.
So it was like more so like, oh, if the judiciary interprets this as unconstitutional because of this one reading of the law, then they can unilaterally declare the law unconstitutional based on this specific reading of it, even though like the congressional intent was a different reading.
Okay. So it seems like almost as soon as these separations of powers were put into place, each one of these powers started to amass independence or autonomy or power over
The others.
themselves, over the others or via themselves.
Yeah, and I think part of what like beyond Marbury, the Civil War did not help because of the states' rights issue and like moving away from going to a larger federal government centralized approach, and so
Yeah.
that kind of catalyzed the ballooning of federal government, which is obviously means reduce states' rights. And they did that via expanding the 10th Amendment Commerce Clause and Dormant Commerce Clause, which basically, because the Constitution gives Congress the ability to regulate commerce. And there was a period, they expanded it, and there was a period of contraction and another expansion in the 20th century. I believe that was, if I remember, that was called the Lanham era, was the second period of expansion. Don't quote me on that. It might have been the opposite, but um, basically that gave Congress more autonomy with respect to regulating uh, how much states can prevent commerce passing in and out of their borders. And
Mm-hmm.
that allowed them, like, for example, in the 1940s, there was a case where the federal government prosecuted a man. I believe this is on the East Coast. It might have been like North Carolina. I can't remember exactly, but they prosecuted a man for growing too much grain on his property
Yeah.
because that was interfering with interstate commerce. Because him growing grain meant he didn't have to buy grain on the market, which means it affected the stock price or the like basically
Mm-hmm.
derivative prices of grain, thereby affecting interstate commerce because it
Mm-hmm.
affected the price. So like that was really once you start doing that kind of thing, it's over.
Yeah. So there is this heated discussion online between, I guess, the classical liberals slash center right and the outer right, dissident right, about the Constitution being dead. And it's it's very emotional for some reason from the point of view of the classical centrists. They really don't like people saying that. But if you look at all of the metrics for just to what degree the original Constitution of the Constitution in 1887, 1787 is actually viable, like both in letter and in spirit, and actually the law of the land. And it's not true. I don't know. What do you think about that? Is the Constitution dead? Is it real? Is that what we are living under, like that Constitution?
Well, the Constitution is like it's a living constitution.
Okay.
Um, so I mean, as long as it's still living, by like as long as we're still operating within that framework, it's not dead. That's
Okay.
kind of it's paradoxical because it's like, okay, well, it's a living constitution. So to say it's dead for the very reason why it's still relevant is kind of
So what
makes
to
more
what
sense.
degree is it relevant? And to what
Well,
degree?
it's relevant insofar that there's this really, really awesome speech by Justice Scalia. It was like back in like 2016. And the crux of the speech was that we are unlike from the beginning of our nation. We have been unlike other nations, other democracies, other states, not because of our Bill of Rights, not because of like whatever promise set of rights or et cetera, but because of the fact that we have checks and balances. For example, and he pointed out that there's a ton of different states that have Bill of Rights. They have a Bill of Rights. They even have greater freedom of the press to the point where, if there is an attempt to subvert the press or to censor speech, they have laws that will basically allow prosecution of someone who is inhibiting speech. But at the end of the day, just because they have those rights, it's just right a sentence on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Because if you're an autocrat, that means nothing to you. Um, and he describes this push and pull that like this push and pull like between right Republicans and Democrats, even though like George Washington, the two-party problem, but whatever. It's what the point stands that because of this push and pull, because of this like constant butting of heads, our system is inefficient, and that's good.
Hmm.
Because if it's inefficient and it's slower and it's harder to change things, then that inhibits the ability for an autocrat to come in and unilaterally just like wreak havoc on the nation. And so Scalia said, like next time you hear like, oh, well, it's getting bad. People are butting heads. Like we can't get anything done. Well, people have been saying that since day one.
Hmm.
It's been the problem since day one. But really, in the context of government, you want the government to move as slowly as possible and be as kind of constrained to act as possible in that manner. Otherwise, you will have an ever expanding and ever bloating state. So, like something that I guess growth is a artificial growth limiter on that is good. So it's good that we have this conflict because it's like it keeps it in the middle.
Does it though? I mean, I can understand at certain points it could be constrained, but over the long arc of our nation, it just inevitably bloats and bloats and bloats and bloats and bloats, and that's where we're at right now.
Well,
It always errs on the side of bloating itself, and it doesn't seem like it's been meaningfully restrained in any way.
comparatively, it has. For example, like comparatively to, and Scalia mentioned this specifically in the context of like a parliamentary system with respect to like the UK.
Mm.
Um, right, they vote in almost like parties at a time. So there's like always consensus or there's like majority consensus or a plurality. And there's less of a natural inhibitor within that type of system. And so if you look at the EU, they're way further ahead of us in the scale of state surveillance, state control. They have laws against like certain types of hateful speech
Yeah.
that's incredibly ambiguous and arbitrary. So comparatively, at least like from the perspective of the EU, we have been a lot more successful at
Mm.
pushing back against this. And so this is why postmodernism became necessary.
Mm.
Um, and it was because of our success at pushing back the tide. And if you look at what postmodernism, deconstructionism, and like for example, like Derridian literary analysis does, is it changes the meaning of a word and it attaches a new heuristic to a word. And that is what allows them a backdoor into legislation and using judicial interpretation, judicial review. So, and they'll start working on a word, right? And within a decade, 2 decades, that word will have a completely different meaning.
Hmm.
And this starts in academia, and they'll start using this word in a new manner in academia. And a decade, 2 decades later, you'll see this new definition work its way into the judicial opinions.
Hmm.
Now suddenly the judges are interpreting language and legislation that was written 60 years ago with a word whose definition changed a decade or two ago.
Hmm.
And they do this with a legal doctrine called purposivism. So there's two different types of legal analysis or legal interpretation. One is textualism, one is purposivism. Sorry, purposivism. I always miss the word. But
Yeah.
but textualism and this was Scalia's whole thing, and it's to a slightly lesser extent, it's Justice Clarence Thomas's thing. But Scalia was like the textualist on the bench. And so what textualism is it's looking at the plain letter of the law. Like, what does the law mean? And like, what did those words mean at the time it was written?
Okay.
Purposivism is looking at the law and thinking, what was the intent when this law was written? And then wildly extrapolating the intent, kind of
Yeah.
irrespective of like the text as an anchor.
Yeah. They could have just called it contextualism and textualism, but
Yeah. Yeah. A lot
and
easier to
so
say.
that postmodernism, does it always only work in one direction? Expansion?
Well, the right does it too.
Yeah.
And how they do it, for example, um, they do it in the context. I think abortion is a really good example.
Hmm.
Not that I'm like not pro-life or not that I'm pro-choice, but um, they they're playing a bunch of word games right now with respect to what the definition of an abortion is. And they're attaching, like post hoc, right, this definition intent. They're saying in order for something to be an abortion, you had to intend to kill it, but somehow intent, they're redefining intent too. So intend to kill is like you have to intend to for asterisk convenience, even though you intend to kill an ectopic pregnancy, but you didn't do it because of convenience, therefore there's no intent. And so
Okay.
it's kind of it's really it really it sounds postmodern-y. When you look at what they're doing with the language, it's identical. It's just a different, it's just okay because it's right our team versus their team.
Hmm.
But I mean, this kind of like devolution of I guess prioritizing truth is just catalyzing this and like making it spiral out of control. Because then it's like, oh, everything's fair game now.
Prioritizing truth, is that what you said? I
Yeah,
missed
well,
that.
when there isn't a
Without.
prioritization of truth and I guess like let's say Socratic dialectic and the discerning of truth, meeting a good faith middle, then you're going to have this constant underhanded back and forth where each side is using these underhanded linguistic and relativistic word
Okay.
games um, to basically, as they speak, they reconstruct reality.
Okay. So it's a descent into sophistry. And
Yes.
sophistry is motivated or instantiated for the sake of one team's power. So it reduces everything into who has power, the power
Yes.
to define a word.
Hmm.
Like the word vaccine can be
Yeah.
redefined
Mhm.
depending on who is in control of the dictionary, and then
Or male, female.
male and female.
Yeah.
So once that becomes the rule or just the terms of engagement, what is the counter to that without Yeah, what's the counter to that? Do you have to like reestablish like a parallel interpretive community of the left and the right that is able to embark on truth seeking, Socratic dialogue, decision making?
Um, I think the only way to fix this is through a different framing of the world.
Hmm.
And via like basically meaning.
Okay. Yeah.
So if there isn't this type of orienting purpose or meaning, then you get a type of instrumentalism or utilitarianism where everyone external to yourself is just a tool in your game. Um, and what kind of holds that at bay is being accountable to something greater than yourself outside yourself. And we've kind of seen as secularity has become more widespread, um, this has disintegrated, and the founding mythos is no longer sufficient to be that like nationalism, a sense of pride. That's no longer sufficient to be um, that orienting, I
Unifier.
guess, guide for like a higher purpose or a higher set of principles.
Yeah. So instead of people from all varieties of life or a certain range of livelihood and life living, agreeing or being harmonized by a higher transcendent purpose or framework, the framework's localized in themselves, and that framework is then how do I advance my own self? And instead of harmonizing with people, it turns into demanding, redefining, positioning, positionality, and you get what is inevitably the consequence of what this pride thing is going to be, if not already, which is just everybody out for themselves. Very
And this is a
temporary,
result of
momentary.
Protestantism.
Po-
Protestantism actually, it paradoxically, Protestantism caused this.
Protestantism, not
Yes.
positivism. I just wanted to
No,
clarify
yeah,
that.
Protestant, yeah.
Okay. Which
Uh,
locates the interpretive faculty not in the priestly caste
yeah,
and not in God,
in
but
every man is church unto himself. Every man is
yes.
God unto himself. And so
Okay.
it's infinite schismatism, infinite atomization.
Yeah.
And there's been books written about specifically in the context of the United States, like the book like the weirdest people in the world, referring to Americans.
Yeah.
And like that Protestant ethic, while simultaneously being extremely um successful at mobilizing individuals to self-actualize,
Mm.
it's really bad at at providing a unifying kind of propulsion.
Yeah. Because you're not the boss of me. I guess that's the other argument that is staked against the dissident right, kind of the Constitutionist. I don't feel like I've done that argument justice, either argument justice, but they say, James Lindsay has said, and I've heard it repeated against the people who are saying, we're in a post-liberal, post-constitutional order. People are saying liberalism's core principle or ethic is that you are not God. But that's the negative. I mean, that's just kind of trusting people are going to not think that they're God, because without like God, like you're going to
Hmm.
locate God in yourself. I don't know. Like, okay, you're
Well,
not
yeah,
God. I'm
right.
not God. You're not God of
Say you're
me.
not, I may not be God, but I can be the mouthpiece of God.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or
Um,
effectually, I'm not God, but my will be done.
yeah, or in Carl Schmitt's kind of,
Hmm.
right, in the Carl Schmitt, he was a German jurist.
Yeah.
He he created this idea of the state of exception.
Yeah.
And he said that is what gives governments power and authority, is the ability to grant exceptions.
Yeah, I would rephrase that as whoever gets to define the state of exception is the one in power. That's, you could say that. I think it's just describing
Well, he said
how do you know
God,
who's power?
right? you have to, like, in order to be able to grant those exceptions, you have to create this illusion or sentiment that God has granted permission to the state to act on his behalf.
Yeah.
And that is how you get the authority to grant exceptions.
Yeah.
It is a divine authority.
Yeah.
So, like, when you spare someone, when you pardon someone, that is God pardoning you, not the state. And so, therefore, the state is not like exempting itself from its own rule. God is coming through the state and exempting itself from rule.
Yeah.
And so there never really is a contradiction in that sense.
Oh, okay. Okay. Could you hold on to that thought, the contradiction? Because that might be a way of building a counter to that. But during the COVID response period, many governors, including my governor, Jay Inslee, granted themselves executive emergency authority. And they just
Yeah.
did that. And I think Jay Inslee still has that. Now, to what extent they could actually implement that was kind of a dance. They couldn't completely strip everybody of their rights, and they had to put up with a certain amount of dissent or, non-compliance, but they still granted themselves the authority to do that. And they've granted themselves the authority in Washington to promote racialized, equity agendas and to do all these different various things. So I guess there's that justification that allows them to do that without any contradiction, because I don't know. Could you explain that? Because I think in the case of an emergency, that's one exception. In times of war, I get to tell you what to do. I can conscript you. In times of panic or not, danger, I can tell you to stay inside of your house. I can restrain you. And is the only counter to that you just can't tell me what to do, and there will be no unified action in case of an emergency, in case of,
So this idea that the state has the power to break its own rules, right? It's in a like philosophically, in a roundabout way, it's right, granted by God, granted by the divine. And in
hmm,
modernity, we
hmm,
are heavily influenced by Enlightenment thought. Enlightenment thought is a product of Spinoza, and we have that another product of Enlightenment thought, which is Hegel. Spinoza was a pantheist. He said that God is nature. And in that, right,
hmm.
now you don't have to almost plead for intercession. If God is nature and humans are a product of nature, well, then the state can be God. And Hegel comes in, like with the Hegelian dialectic. He says that he has a presuppositionalist system, which means there are no starting axioms because the end presupposes its beginning.
Okay.
And
It's just kind
so,
of there, spinning in space. Comes from
well,
nowhere, goes to nowhere. Just is.
well, it's the end is what confirms the statements made
Okay, that's that
about the world in the
Ouroboros
present.
symbol.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And Hegel had this concept of the absolute idea. So in you basically you have the thesis and the antithesis, being nothing, and you have multiple iterations of synthesis. And in the end, you have the absolute idea. The absolute idea for Hegel is God, but for Hegel, God is the state. So God is the state.
Why did he land on the state?
Um, as well, he has different, like you can apply the Hegelian dialectic fractally, right? You can apply to different scales of organization.
Yeah.
But with respect to like his philosophy of history, in the context of history, the end of history is the state. It's the perfect state. It's God. There is no distinction between God and state. And he gets this kind of like dialectical process of of negating and overcoming from Isaac Luria. Isaac Luria was
Hmm.
a Kabbalist in the 16th century.
Yeah.
And he drew a lot from Isaac Luria. He drew a lot from Jakob Boehme, and he drew a lot from Spinoza. He actually got his kind of, let's say, pantheism from Jakob Boehme. And Jakob Boehme got it from a guy named Paracelsus, who was a Swedish physician who got it from an Italian Kabbalist mystic who got it from Isaac Luria.
Okay.
And so it's a direct kind of path from Isaac Luria to Hegel. And why Hegel can do this, why Hegel can assert kind of this pantheistic system, is all of this idea from Isaac Luria took. It's called Simsum. And Simsum is Isaac Luria's creation story. And in Simsum, there's this idea, and this is where it gets Gnostic, where there is God. God is everything. God is omnipotent, but God had an irritant. In order to get rid of the irritant, God had to, right? There's a divine expansion and then contraction. And so God contracted himself and left a space in himself where he wasn't there. And after that, there was this process called the breaking of the vessels, where God put his divine light into vessels and they shattered.
Clip off.
And that's where you get the 10 Sephirotic emanations, which is also known as Ein Sof for the tree of life. And the corporeal is the very last emanation. That's physical reality. And for Isaac Luria, what this meant was that evil was no longer an absence of good. Evil was a positive force. Evil is the counterpart to light. And part of this is because that if there's nothing there, if God is contracting, but God is simultaneously the only thing in existence, if there is evil in the world, then that means that has to have been a positive injection from God. And so Isaac Luria came to this conclusion that that meant there's a primeval evil in the divine. So God is both good and evil. And the whole purpose of how there's different interpretations of like what this irritant is, but ultimately it's kind of demiurgic, where the corporeal is like reality is bad. It was created out of malice, not in a divine creative act. And in this malice, what the result of this malice is that the divine sparks become entrapped in hus. And the job of the individual is to perform good deeds or mitzvahs and free the spark from the husk and undergo the divine ascent, Jacob's ladder. So the world was created coming down Ein Sof, Sephirotic emanations. The goal of the individual is to travel back up it. And so there's another complication that comes with this. Because God had to exit the space where he created, what this means according to Isaac Luria and according to his interpreters, is that in order to create the world, God had to kill himself. And so in order to put the pieces back together, the individuals freeing the divine spark are putting the pieces of God back together. And so it renders those individuals God-men. And so, and that there's also a level of relativism there. Like, for example, the word abracadabra means I create as I speak. And so this kind of understanding of the world lends itself to a form of relativism where there is no objective reality, right? Because God is no longer alive in the primordial sense. Man is God. And so now man is capable of that initial creative act. And so man can create in a capacity that's on par with the divine. And this creates problems with respect to let's say, antinomianism, which is when you had Sabati and Jacob Frank. They were both coming out of the Lurianic tradition, and they both practiced something called antinomianism, which is the intentional breaking of the law in order to force the coming of the Messiah. And they went around doing like having a bunch of like sacrifices, having orgies, and, like a bunch of weird stuff. They were declared by the rabbinic authorities at the time. They were declared heretics. It was a big mess, but we actually. Oddly enough, it was very, very influential. They were influential within the Jacobin movement. They were influential in the Masonic lodges.
Facade.
Yeah, everywhere. And now think of it in the context of postmodernity, like with Walter Benjamin, with the postmodernists, with the deconstructionists, or with the Derridian idea of a trace in literary analysis. What they're functionally doing is they're creating as they speak. They're creating an alternative reality. And if you go into, I guess, the different thinkers of the Frankfurt School, if you go into like Derrida's kind of mystical dabblings, Walter Benjamin was a Kabbalist. Derrida was a Kabbalist. Uh, I've even seen Judith Butler lecture on Kabbalah, and Adorno has writings with Benjamin about this. It's incredibly influential in modernity and in our understanding of the Enlightenment. Like it's influenced a huge percentage of Enlightenment era thinkers. Now back to the state thing, with respect to like, how does the state have authority to grant exceptions for itself to its own law? Well, if the state is God, when a state, the equivalent of God, when a state is granting an exception to its own being, it's participating in the creative acts. It's
Yeah.
creating a space within itself to where it allows itself an exception, like in Simsum. It's creating a space where this act of creation can occur. And that act of creation is an exception of its own, is an exception to its own being. Kind of like where like a place where God does not exist is oxymoronic to the concept of God because it's killing
Yeah.
omnipotence.
Yeah.
And
It's
is
lawless.
yeah,
Yeah, there's no law in
mhm,
this within the law. The law
yes. It
creates a
creates a
space within the
space,
law.
yeah, yeah, basically a space of anarchism within itself from which it can operate and purge the bad actors or whatever it needs to purge,
Yeah.
or purge the freedoms it would like to purge.
Yeah.
And
Or
that's
do some sort of protective act
yes,
for its
and I
people on behalf of its people.
yes, yeah, and it kind of like, for example, with martial law, and we see this concept in different iterations, Simsum being very, very influential in multiple areas. For example, Freud's concept of the Oedipal complex is Simsum within the brain. It's this idea of making room inside yourself where you can break free of that like devouring mother. And it's kind of, and Freud was a Kabbalist. Jung was also a Kabbalist. He uses archetypes to kind of explain this dynamic, but at its very core, like he was very into like Kabbalah and understanding the world in terms of emanation and kind of tiers and levels
Hmm.
and interconnectedness.
Hmm.
And so a huge chunk of philosophy and literary analysis and law and political theory is influenced by this almost pantheistic monism. Well, a combination of pantheistic monism and Lurianic dualism. Um, so it's like dualism within a monistic system because of that primeval evil and space where God does not exist aspect. So
Okay.
it's it's a weird acosmism that functionally looks like pantheism.
Okay. So that describes, according to my understanding, or makes sense when I apply it to postmodernists and to the behavior of the left, both on the streets and in power, and how they operate to, what's that called? Stochastic terrorism? Not stochastic terrorism. It's some sort of anarchy where the state disempowers the self and allows anarchy to reign supreme.
Monarchism?
No, not monarchism. That's
No,
the king thing.
minarch. Minarch?
No, well, it's just this cool little phrase that it gets banged around in the right about it's just functional anarchy. Where
Anarcho-capitalism?
no, not capitalism either. It's why can't I think of it? But so if you look at San Francisco, I actually it was Oakland. I think it was floating around Twitter today. Oakland, there's street crews are now refusing to fix streets because they don't feel safe going down these streets, right? So the city can't do its job because the city's not doing its job. And the state is, there's another story that was out yesterday.
Planned obsolescence?
It's something like that. It's really close. I'll probably think of it later on, but you can see it operating in blue cities where there's just this anarchy that I think it's anarcho-tyranny. That's what it is. So the state has, so the state takes over the subway system because the subway system's not safe because people can't defend themselves on the subway system. And the state is enabling by not prosecuting felons for just crime to fester. So the state at once is causing the problem and then also disempowering anybody to solve that problem. And, if you have like in New York City, it's really interesting because you have the Trump verdict happening, which is very specious from people along a wide variety of political persuasions, what happened with Trump with the 34 convictions or whatever. And at the same time that they are pursuing this one person who would disrupt their power, they're just like not prosecuting all these felons over and over and over and over again. So I kind of see what you're talking about operating there, and then also with regard to Antifa and just like the left in general with their weird query stuff. But like, how does that apply to the right? How is the right using that? Or are they just meeting that in order to reestablish a
They're doing the
counter
same
to that?
thing. For example, Hegel was a right winger. He was a conservative. He believed that the absolute idea that that in his time they had reached the end of history with the Prussian monarchy. He liked the Prussian monarchy.
So he
So,
was working to justify it in perpetuity? Is that what he thought he
well,
was doing?
he was trying to create a political theology. He was trying to solve that. He was trying to close the gap between theology and philosophy. And he did that by attempting to solve the Kantian problem, which is the attempted remediation between phenomena and noumena, or immanent and transcendence. And Kant had come to the conclusion that essentially you'll never be able to fully close the immanent transcendent gap. And transcendent is basically ontology, in the sense that you can understand an object for its ontological true nature, for as it exists for itself, as opposed to the phenomenal or the immanent is you having to know that object through mediated through your own subjectivity. And so because everything you understand, everything you observe is inherently mediated through your own perspective, through your own subjectivity, you'll never grasp a thing as it exists for itself in and of itself. And Hegel said that doesn't matter. Knowledge will eventually reveal itself through a dialectical process as history unfolds. And essentially what that is that that's an epistemology that says that as history unfolds, as we understand the philosophy of history, there really is no form of knowledge or nothing that we cannot discern. Everything reveals itself in time. And if that's heretical in the context of the existence of an ineffable, because it's blending the immanent transcendent. And Eric Vogelin uses the word, it's immanentizing the eschaton. Because previous, like, right, if God is transcendent, separate, is separate but interactive with the immanent. How the eschaton will arrive or the methods by which it will arrive are known only to the ineffable. But if you can pull the transcendent down into the immanent, now you can force the will of the divine essentially, because now it's in the domain of your control. If it's separate and independent and your existence is dependent upon it, but its existence is not dependent on you, then there's no way that you can really discern what the end of history will look like or how to bring it about. And so it's a level of kind of hubris and like essentially like almost like a Nietzschean will to power, but will to power at the on the scale of the state, where now the state is can control the will of God because now the state is God.
Mm-hmm. So by the state being the end of history or God manifest, is that a state of being or a state of process? Like how does, because the state is actually like a bunch of bureaucratic mechanisms. Is that what Hegel is referring to? Like these processes that kind of just run itself and that human beings are participating in, and some people have more or less standing within this
So
interhuman force?
Hegel has a very, it depends on who you ask. It depends on who is interpreting Hegel, because there's a strain of neo-Kantianism and almost, let's say, within Marxism. What's essentially going on there is the state is envisioned as the utopia. So it's utopian idealism, but also within under a type of messianism,
Mm-hmm.
or let's say apocalyptic messianism. The state is also the Messiah. So the Messiah is utopia. The coming of the Messiah is the manifestation of utopia because it
It's
saves
manifest on
mankind.
the level of mass being. So all the people
Yes.
in the state are
Mm.
experiencing the Messiah in the way that they live
Yes.
and the way that they interact. And it's all
Mhm.
intermediated by either the system or the system has created them into the image of itself. And
So
that's where you have.
it's mutually transformative. So the Geist interacts with the Geist is the spirit that Hegel talks about. And it's similar to the Kabbalistic concept of Shekinah, or in let's say Vladimir Solovyev's kind of um heresy, Sophia or wisdom. So it's mutually informative as mankind interacts with it, it interacts with mankind. And there's this back and forth, uh, let's say development, mutual development. And it eventually manifests in perfection, which is the Messiah. And so this kind of like mutual back and forth development is developing the ethic and the moral framework of the society. And
Mhm.
so the Geist is kind of like, it's a little bit like the Holy Spirit a little bit. But the Holy Spirit doesn't change in conjunction with mankind. It just informs and interacts. And with the Geist, it's mutually, let's say,
Hmm.
transformative.
Okay. So it's still. So I mean that makes sense that in communist manifestations they're trying to create a state, but they also realize that they have to create a people for the state because so many people
Mm,
are just not
yeah.
functional within this utopia. So they have to either kill or transform or re-educate,
Mm,
depending on how hard or soft they want to project their power. And so if you look at queer theory or how the United States education system is taking over or utilizing race theory, critical theories of all sorts, they're trying to mold a populace in the image of the state. And that state, for some reason, right now looks very degenerate from my point of view, at least.
Yeah, in the image of the ideal state that is yet to come.
Okay. Where it's just, everybody is purely able to project their identity, their sexuality, except for race. They have to do some weird stuff where the race is solid, but the gender is fluid. And I don't know if it's a coherent system or not, but it seems like it's all operating to just swallow and mold the entire generation into its image, into perfect.
Almost like a mirror where like every individual is a reflection of every other individual, and
Like a
the
hologram.
collective individual, yes. And where the collective individuals are a reflection of the state, and the state is a reflection of the collective of individuals. So it's like everyone is constantly basically a reflection of everyone else.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, oh, well, then where's the actual subject? Like if everyone's a reflection, where'd the subject go? Well,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
you want to remove it. You want to like that's how Hegel remediated Kant is you have to remove subjectivity. If you remove subjectivity, then you remove that transcendent immanent problem. So if everything is a reflection of everything else, you've accomplished that ontological object in and of itself.
okay.
Because
Just
there
like,
is no subjectivity.
and that is manifest in the sexual mores of polyamory, where specifically, well, men just kind of get to exert their desires, and then women kind of just become whatever sexuality is being put upon them because they're acting out of empathy, and men are acting out of compulsion. And then you just have this weird mess of people remaining at a very low complexity
Funhouse
relationship.
mirrors instead. It's like a fun house.
Because they can't deal with all of that compromise and intimacy that requires dedication and intense interaction that a monogamous relationship can over years house. But a polygamous society, everybody's just interswappable, interchangeable, and therefore just remain at a lower level of development and kind of act like a swarm, where they're kind of just even fluidly and genetically, they're just kind of swapping all their diseases, and the children belong to everybody else. I mean, I can see like that manifestation if it could scale. I don't know if it can scale or not, but if the state could support that, then it might be able to scale.
And it's also very like consumeristic. Like which is ironic because it's like supposed to be it kind of superficially like resembles a commune, but it's very consumeristic in that it's basically accumulation for the sake of accumulation. It's like consumption for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And part of that, the purpose of that is, for example, part of marriage is self-sacrifice, and kind of not just for the greater, but for the greater good of the community, the family, and to uphold a covenant. Well, within polyamory, it's just who else are you acting on behalf but yourself, while simultaneously appearing to be I guess like simulacrum of a community, but it's super superficial, materialistic, and consumeristic. So that's paradoxical as well.
So when we get to the counter to this way of thought, where do we begin? Do we begin at the law of Moses, right? Where the law is just the law, no matter what. And then the wise man, such as Solomon, will decide the exception or how to implement the law, but the law is still the law, no matter what.
So I actually come to the conclusion that I do not think that pluralistic democracy is possible without basically without having a critical mass of people who subscribe to a Christian ethic. And that's because a pluralistic democracy requires a level of self-sacrifice. And if, like in the polyamory example, if you're only interested in kind of some superficial representation of community, insofar as it enables to serve your own selfishness and your own, I guess,
Immediate.
self-actualization,
Yeah.
then you're
Well,
going to have a basically self-implosion. But within, I guess, a Christian ethic prioritizes life and living and reviles death. But you cannot prioritize life and living without simultaneously willing to sacrifice to uphold that higher ideal.
mhm.
Because if that's your orienting principle, and as soon as things get tough or things begin to be that principle is challenged in any way, if you're not willing to sacrifice to continue to uphold that principle, then there goes your pluralistic democracy.
And that's the way to build it from the ground up and not just the top down. So Christian national, or the specter of Christian nationalism, is an
Yeah, that's
imposition
garbage.
of
Garbage, yeah.
that. But it's got to be like a society of people who have Christian ethic, who are willing, when the need arises, to sacrifice for, a higher tier of,
Mm.
or a broader span of other that can
And
supersede
partly
ethnic lines.
and partly because a top-down Christian nationalism, it's kind of like what it creates, especially when it's taken by force, is it creates it creates a simulacrum of a Christian ethic, and it's not a genuine Christian ethic. And partly because you have a level of instrumentalism that was existent in it from its inception. Because in order to create let's say a government under Christian nationalism, you have to take steps that are not acting in the likeness of Christ, right? Because what did Christ say about Caesar? Like, be given to Caesar what is Caesar's. And that's precisely why Christ was not accepted by like the Jewish people. It's because he did not conquer with a sword. He conquered, right, through his actions and like through the love of the Father, and through giving of himself, self-sacrifice, to those who didn't deserve it. Um, Christian nationalism is the opposite. It's taking what one thinks one deserves.
Well, if you were to have a Caesar no matter what, wouldn't you rather have a Christian Caesar?
No, because that's not Christian. Like it will they won't be a Christian.
So, but what happens in a Christian society? Is there no Caesar? There's no
Well,
government.
here's the
This is
thing.
the
So
weakness in that case.
it's not that you can't have a Christian Caesar. It's that if you change the government or you change society from a top-down way so that you can have a Christian Caesar, that is a transformative act, and it's not transformative in a good way.
Hmm.
Um, because of the fact, so, and you can kind of see this in a lot of the thinkers the Christian nationalists draw from. They draw from it tends to be Carl Schmitt. So what's interesting about Carl Schmitt, I talked about him earlier with respect to a state of exception. Christian nationalism, the only way it would work is if it's a state of exception. A Christian monarchy might work, but a Christian nationalist a system of government, no, it won't work because it's not Christian anymore because it's pantheistic. In order to be a state that is able to grant an exception in that way, you have to be self-contradictory, and you have to be able to like basically claim to intercede, to be the interceder on behalf of the people, um, in communication with the divine. And so you can grant exceptions to your own rule of law because you have the divine's permission, but obviously you don't really. You're you're claiming to be God because that's like Carl Schmitt's system is pantheistic.
Okay, to try to digest that with my mind. So a nation that claims to act as a Christian nation will have the veneer of Christ, but in act, it will be that a nation's not Christian, or it can't be, a nationalism can't be Christian, or a state is not a Christian.
So how are you distinguishing nation and state?
I don't know. I'm trying to understand how. So a Christian nation on one level would be a citizenry who have internalized Christian doctrine, and then that's manifest at the level of the state. Christian
Yes.
nationalism is where the state
Mhm.
intentionally says we are now going to
Yes.
cause the citizenry to act as though they were Christian,
Yep. And that's also precisely
which is
violating.
not Christian.
Yes, people because what is that? God expressly gave mankind free will.
Yeah.
And that's another way it's a state of exception because it's saying, "Oh, now I'm God. I'm reneging. No more free will."
Okay. Until we get our way, which is again a utopian project. Like,
Yeah, and that's how it's
okay.
mutually transformative, right? Oh, like I'm taking free will back, but I'll give it back to you once we
Once the
develop
exception.
together and we reach a state at which you're good enough to where we can give it back to you.
Okay. So that is one critique of Christian nationalism, but you said pluralistic democracy is not possible in your point of view without internalized Christian ethic in the citizenry. So there would be a theocratic government and then something that's not quite theocratic that would be secular on some level where nobody's imposing any religious order on anybody, where people can leave aside certain doctrinal disputes in order to relate with each other, and then also filter through the law certain sorts of Christian virtues without the theology on some level. Like there's Islamic law. I don't know to what degree like Eastern law or Eastern states are even a part of this discussion. But in a pluralistic society, what sounds like you're trying to describe is a way where everybody kind of has freedom of conscience, but there's still some sort of order that checks based on
Yeah,
some sort of
so
law between interactions.
within a pluralistic democracy, and like we've had since the beginning of the United States, the reason why that works is because there's a level of self-sacrifice. And so, in that self-sacrifice, that selflessness, it's right, it's acting in the likeness of Christ. And so, for example,
That
um,
sacrifice, just to put a asterisk there, that sacrifice isn't just like going out and doing community labor. It's also sacrificing your own ego insofar as being right, saying, I know the will of God. I'm going to sacrifice my opinion to allow others to have their own opinion on certain matters.
yeah, I'll put it in terms of the trolley problem, for example. Say like, and I think this level of sacrifice that basically Christians demand of Christians, just like
Hmm.
I think we should preface this with like, interpret this a little bit fluid or a little bit abstract. Um, and like kind of like view it in a multi-scenario, not necessarily like a life death type of situation. But say if you were a Christian and you were sitting at a juncture and by a set of train tracks. And on one set of train tracks, there's four Christians tied up, laying on the rail. And on the other rail, there was one non-Christian tied up. Now, if you're a Christian, you're going to sit there. Who are you going to kill? You have to pick. You have to
Yeah. Well,
run.
can I just give the answer and you can check my homework?
Sure.
Okay. So you would probably say the Christians are already saved. The atheist or the non-Christian has not had the opportunity to come to Christ or to taste redemption. So the Christians are saved already.
Yes. Yeah. So you kill the Christians, even though those are your own people. This is why a Christian ethic is the only way pluralism works.
Because the jihadist or the Islamist would make the other decision?
Well, yeah, well, one, yes, but also in the context of like white nationalism or like ethnic,
Okay.
um,
Solidarity movements.
yes,
Okay.
they're always going to pick their own kind. But
Yeah.
a Christian ethic is self-sacrificial to their own in-group, their own kind, to
Hmm.
benefit others.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's that kind of like self-giving, even to your own detriment, because that's what Christ commanded. And
Yeah,
that's what
this, yeah.
allows pluralism to work.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but isn't that a prisoner's dilemma? If we kill off all the Christians, there are going to be no Christians left. Or like to dial it back down, but still to have the heat on. If, insofar as white Christians are internally going to submit themselves to affirmative action and give up places in positions of power and allow minorities a leg
But that's not
up
what that
and
is. So, like, this scenario does not require that type of concession, right? It like it does not
hmm,
require you to be totally concede to the
just lay
demand.
on the tracks everything.
Well, it's like part of self-sacrifice is remaining firm, right? Part of self-sacrifice is not bending the knee for social gain. It's not just kind of unidirectional, where
Hmm.
it's like, oh, I'm not going to do this thing, not because not doing it benefits me. I'm not going to do this thing because not doing it like my principles are would prohibit me from doing that thing, even though doing that thing would benefit me in the short term.
Oh, well, but in the context of racial justice, so called, let's try to work out this logic here. The white Christian is called upon to sacrifice their privilege in order to share that privilege, positions of prestige and opportunities to others. Are you saying that that self-sacrifice, because it is hanging on the thing of whiteness, is
No.
already doomed from the
So
beginning?
that's almost like a syncretism between Christian ethic and a pantheistic understanding of what whiteness is, right? There
Okay.
is no whiteness within a Christian ethic, right? For example, like there is no Jew and Gentile in Christ.
Hmm.
So like, you don't have to accept their framing of the situation. That's not what an applied Christian ethic is. It's not like conceding that, oh yes, I am white, therefore I subscribe to this unsubstantiated oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
Hmm.
No, because a Christian ethic reifies hierarchy because that's part of what giving unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It's accepting hierarchy, but what's happening with respect to like this whiteness, that's a dismantling of hierarchy. And this is why it's messianic. For example, this whiteness, kind of like oppressor oppress, they're looking for a savior to save them from the Romans. So looking for a savior to save them from white supremacy. They're looking for someone, a politician, an ideology, a revolution to intercede on their behalf to save them from this force of whiteness that they say is oppressing them. Now, if the Christians were to help them and intercede on their behalf against whiteness, now they would be taking the role of the Messiah that Jesus never was.
Okay.
Jesus, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Because they're not, because whiteness in that framework is Caesar and the powers that be that are oppressing everybody. And
Yes.
Jesus didn't come to be that kind of Messiah. But to put a fine point on it, individual acts of self-sacrifice could fall in line with that agenda. Like, I'm going to sacrifice my position. I'm going to act in humility. But because you're sacrificing to a false god, it doesn't really work,
Yes,
because
exactly. Exactly.
you're denigrating.
That's the golden calf. That's not altruistic. You're not acting. So for
Even
example,
if you're not virtue signaling, you're enabling behavior that is going to stunt people at scale, because they're not going to, through a meritocratic process, achieving hierarchy. They're always going to be relying on the state, relying on this policy, relying on this ideology to get ahead, rather than relying on their own
well,
ability to sacrifice and achieve.
I'm converting to Orthodox Christianity.
Oh, okay. So we were going to get there, but here we are.
And so kind of in the context of by grace through faith, like that's the only like way to be saved. Through by grace through faith, you cannot through your own acts become Christ-like. You have to, right? You're saved by grace through faith, and through intercession or through basically being filled with the Holy Spirit is what allows you to gain the strength to act more similarly to Christ. And that's how you can partake in altruism for God. Like you're not necessarily capable of altruism through your own will.
Yeah.
And attempting to be altruistic or saying you're altruistic when it's an action of your own kind of inspiration isn't you can make an argument that's never true altruism. So it's like, even if you do give up your position, it's like, oh, I'm giving up my position because I'm just like I just want to self-sacrifice to help the poor and needy. Well, you could argue that without that process of kind of salvation and strength like bestowed upon you, even in those instances where you do sacrifice like that, it's still self-aggrandizing. It's still so you will get praise, and you're kind of rendering yourself as God man, as a church unto himself, where people would praise you for doing miracles and like granting your position somebody else the miracle you're performing.
Yeah. And not to mention that you might be doing positive or net evil or wrong or net not good, because you're weakening the process by which good things happen by giving up all of the work. Sacrifice isn't just giving up your position, it's actually making the system better iteratively. And I really enjoy the concept of grace. Enjoy is the wrong word, but that's the linchpin for me. The grace, and then faith. Faith is secondary to being informed, but faith is that which allows you to attenuate yourself to the divine will. But the divine will is still like you're polishing, let's say, your antenna, or participating in the process of polishing your antenna, but your directions are still coming from somewhere other than your will. Yeah. How did you stumble upon Orthodox Christianity? Did that just like you just started asking questions and this is the one that satisfied?
So there was an incident. It's
Like a
really
bias
weird.
incident?
Sorry?
No, it's a stupid college joke.
Oh,
Bias incident reports, yeah.
I think so. Do you remember that tussle between James Lindsay and Jonathan Pageau?
And who?
And Jonathan Pageau, between James
Yeah.
Lindsay and Jonathan Pageau.
Yeah.
So I probably shouldn't say this.
Lindsay will still love you in the end. Don't worry about it.
So I was looking into this was like back in November, I think. And I had gotten a couple Orthodox books because I had found Jonathan Pageau, and I was trying to figure out, I could not figure out it sounded very like woo woo.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out if it was Gnostic or not, basically, because it sounded kind of similar to the other stuff I'd been reading for a while. And so I got the Cambridge Companion to like Christian mysticism, and I was reading it, and one of the first things it was about was this man named Vladimir Soloveitch. So Vladimir Soloveitch was a Christian mystic in Russia, an Orthodox Christian mystic. And he was drawing, his influence came from German idealism and Jakob Böhme, who was a Christian Kabbalist in the 16th century. And Vladimir Soloveitch did not believe in a triune God. He believed in a four-part God where there was a divine feminine called Sophia. So it was just like taking the Kabbalistic concept of Shekinah, and adding it to Christianity. Like, but there's already the idea of Sophia and Christianity, but he rendered this a whole other deity, a whole other entity.
Or
And
extension of
the
God or dimension of God, maybe.
like the Holy Spirit, like Christ. It was a
Yeah.
fourth part akin to the Holy Spirit in Christ.
Yeah.
And so the God was united in a tetrad as opposed to a trinity.
Hmm.
And he was basically prosecuted for being a heretic by the Russian Orthodox Church. And I can't remember why specifically, but he was never officially declared a heretic, but it was kind of like, stop. And so I was reading that and I hadn't gotten very far into it, but I was like looking at a concept of Sophia and I'm like, that comes from like that's like Gnostic. That's weird. Um and so I sent them to James Lindsay and he's using those against Charlie Pescio. And and I found out later that Vladimir Soloveitch is actually not really someone you should ever listen to in Orthodox, and he's not really accepted at all. And if he is, it's kind of on the fringes. And like, I want to say like a couple days after that event, I was driving to one of my class. I was driving to one of my classes. I had a final that morning because this was like during final season. And I got a text from uh someone I knew from Twitter. They were Orthodox and they're basically telling me to drive safe that morning. And this is super weird because I had never like this person had never texted me anything like that before. And I'd never gotten into a car crash ever. And so they seemed to imply that they were like worried about me on the road. And this person like is from the internet. They didn't live anywhere near me. It was just kind of random. We just like talked about like philosophy and theology and stuff sometimes. Um, and I was like, I didn't respond because I thought it was weird. And so I take my final and I'm driving home and I'm on a highway. I'm going 65 and there's like street sweepers in the corner. And I was this car swerved into my lane because I guess they weren't paying attention like to the three massive street sweepers. And they swerved in front of me, like right before I was getting to the street sweepers, and I had to slam on my brakes. And the car behind me, I had like 2.5 seconds to stop, and the car behind me slammed into me at 65. And I was like, and it hit hard. And I was like,
Hmm.
it's final season. I can't catch a break. And like this is the first car crash I'd ever gotten into, and that person had texted me that morning. I was like, this is really weird. And so I pull over and I get out of my car, and there is not a scratch on my car. And I turn around, and the person who hit me, like their bumper is like a wreck. Like it is smashed in.
Hmm.
And my bumper, like I drive a Jeep Wrangler and they were like in a hybrid. And a Jeep Wrangler, it's like just like a standard bumper. It's plastic. And my sister has a Jeep and she's dented her bumper in by backing into a trash can before. And this person slammed into me going almost 65 and there wasn't no damage underneath it. I went and got my car checked out. No, nothing. Like not even a tiny scratch. And so, I mean, that was that. I got my car and um I was like 5, 6 minutes away from home and I got home and I texted that person back and I was like, how did you how did you know? Like, why did you text me that? Um, and they were like, because this person had also, like, that couple days before, gotten mad at me about the Jonathan Pajot, James Lindsay thing.
Hmm.
Um, and then I was like, how did you? And they're just like told me that like they got like a feeling, and they a really bad feeling that morning, and they just needed to text me. And so that skeeved me out. And then a couple days later, I was reading about Kurt Gödel, um, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Hmm.
And then Gödel's incompleteness theorem basically it states that in a formal system, any any statement that you can make about a formal system with a finite set of axioms, if it is a complete system, like if you have a complete system from those axioms, there will be a true statement about that system that you cannot prove. You cannot create a mathematical proof for, um, based on those axioms. And so it's saying like if your understanding about a computational system is complete, there will always be things about that system that you will not be able to algebraically prove.
There's something
And
in that system that connects to something outside of the system.
yeah, and so basically, I mean, this is in the context, obviously, of number theory, computational theory, and algebraic systems, but um, it has not been falsified, for example, like, for example, understanding the brain as a formalized system. Um, well, by that logic, there will be things about consciousness or the brain that we will not be able to
Hmm.
prove based on the axiomatic set we create to try and encompass the brain as um, a structure comprised of matter. Um,
Hmm.
and his second theorem was that any system, any axiomatic system where all of your axioms can concretely prove all statements about that system is an incomplete system. So if you can prove everything with mathematics or with your axiomatic set, that means your understanding of it, either your axioms are incomplete or your system is incomplete.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's kind of spooky because I read that I read um about Gödel a couple days and I ended up buying his annotated like incompleteness theorem book, but or someone else's book they wrote they annotated his incompleteness paper. And I started like thinking about that situation. And I kind of like applying I kind of extrapolating Gödel upward, say, and I was like, maybe I've made some because I'd been an agnostic atheist for like 7 or 8 years, and this really threw me for a loop. Like it was that kind of
Hmm.
it was that odd.
So is there something in the vibe, sorry for using that word, of Eastern Orthodoxy that allows you to find a chink in your mind where you
Well,
find something
I like
entering?
it because it's internally logically consistent. Um, and part of the reason for its consistency is because of the fact that it did not accept the filioque like the Catholic Church did. And so the Catholic Church had to take a number of steps because of the addition of the filioque. And the filioque is essentially stating that the Holy Spirit is derived from God and Christ. So, as opposed to just God. So the filioque is the addition of and Christ. In the Orthodox Church,
Mm.
it's the Holy Spirit is derived from God, and that's the Godhead. And this kind of required some, I guess, definitional or let's say ontological tweaks down the road in Catholicism. And it kind of set them up for papal supremacy and papal infallibility. And it also eventually like forced them to assert the Immaculate Conception. And like the Immaculate Conception wasn't a thing until 1800. And that's the Immaculate Conception is basically that Mary was in a state of perfection from the time of her conception, as opposed to Mary was born a human like everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
into sin. But yeah, it's the internal consistency, and it's kind of like it because I grew up Protestant, and with Protestantism, it's very everything is black or white. It's very legalistic, moralistic. It's everything is discreetly right or wrong. And if
Mm.
you ask a question, or you interrogate, let's say, internal contradictions, the reaction you get is very not nice. Or they kind of bend over backwards to resolve problems because everything has to be understood discreetly
Okay.
and of sola scriptura. Like, for example, like Kinham and the dinosaurs in Noah's Ark, the whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, my mom made me go there as a kid, and I really did. That kind of like sealed the deal. I was like, this is
So through the procedures of Orthodox Christianity, you are saved from having to figure out everything or be literal or interpret everything. There's a more, it allows you to be more holistic in your approach to
well,
spiritual life.
Protestantism requires sola scriptura, right? So
Okay.
you have to like derive these explanation exclusively from the biblical canon, the biblical text. Whereas in Orthodoxy, you're allowed to rely on the patristics, the church fathers, a large set of extra canonical literature.
Hmm.
You can't do that in Protestantism.
Okay.
And so that leaves you kind of making these weird, almost asserting things that are really huge stretches and like very like leaps in exegesis from the text itself. Because you don't have that other context or you don't have that other like interpretation from the church fathers. And all the like the church fathers, like the a lot of the texts are from a time where they weren't contemporaries of Christ, but they were in the culture. It was within like 1 century, 2 century, 3 centuries after the resurrection. And so the language is more right, I guess similar. Like there's the culture's more similar.
Hmm.
Um, there's a better understanding or better grasp of the cultural context for which the biblical canon was written. Whereas
Yeah.
all of this is removed from Protestantism because of sola scriptura.
Yeah. It comes to you like across time and just you meet it where you are.
Yeah, and
It's,
then every man is a church unto himself, and
yeah.
that induces the schismatism and the
Yeah.
infinitely atomizing like fractalization.
Okay. If if America is to bring it full circle, if America is founded by Protestants, if the Constitution of the United States of America was penned through a Protestant frame of mind, maybe.
21 of those were Masons, so
Oh, so it's
yeah.
Gnostic? So,
It's not exclusively one thing.
okay, yeah.
Um, it's
So do you think it's a functional document? Just before I proceed along
Yes, I
this
think it's a
line of thinking.
functional if we mean workable. I don't believe in utopia. So
Yeah.
like
I'm just
I don't
wondering, when we get to the point that we are at right now, where we know that something's wrong and we know it's not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. Like, is that constitution, is the linchpin between the citizenry and the government, that constitutional document, and how do we constitute ourselves towards that? And is there lessons or wisdoms to be derived from the faith community that you're beginning to venture into that can help, tie, the state and the citizen, or the church, the state and the citizen together to a
Politics is
functioning?
downstream from culture.
Okay.
So if there's a political dysfunction, then that means there's first a cultural dysfunction. And I really don't think the Constitution or any other document for that matter would be capable in any capacity of fixing the culture problem.
Okay.
And so as a functional or like a working document, it does its job. It's doing what it needs to do. The Constitution never claimed to be able to give each individual citizen meaning. That was that was supposed to be, right? That's what religion did. And
Yeah.
religion did do up
And
until
the
the
Constitution was to keep government out of that.
yes, it was to allow religion to do religion's thing.
Yeah.
So these conversations weren't happening where like where you were talking about Christian nationals, but we're forcing religiosity or
Yeah.
forcing a type of religiosity. And so I think the question of whether the Constitution is a living or dead document is a scapegoat, and it's a convenient scapegoat because it's
Okay.
like it can't
Once you cut
talk, it can't
corners.
defend itself, right?
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
anyone defending the Constitution is defending it or denigrating it on ideological grounds. So if the argument is that the evidence that the Constitution is failing is a cultural dysfunction, that's oxymoronic, and that's like a contradictory argument because they're saying, oh, the Constitution isn't doing enough to give each individual citizen meaning. That's evidence that it failed. I'd say that's evidence that it succeeded.
But it also failed to keep government from becoming infected by a meaning-making apparatus that, for
Well,
sake of
chicken or the egg? Did government become a meaning-making apparatus because individuals themselves lost their meaning and they replaced it with the state, which is what Robert Nisbet thinks. Robert Nisbet thinks
Yeah.
what happens when
Did we fail
religiosity
liberalism, or
breaks
did
down.
liberalism fail us? Is the
Exactly.
question. Yeah.
And I think we failed liberalism, and Robert Nisbet does too. He wrote the book, The Quest for Community. He says, when community breaks down, individuals are left looking for higher and higher and higher structures to defer to, and community breaks down as a result of secularization. So secularization dismantles the community, and therefore the individual members of the community are looking for a replacement God, and they eventually turn towards the state, and they're looking to the federal government. They're looking towards pop culture, these meaning making kind
Yeah.
of stand-ins
Yeah.
to be their guiding orientation. And so by getting rid of a transcendent divine, they gave permission to the government to act as a divine.
Yeah. And then the people within the government also did that too. And then the government gets to do what the government does and totalize itself, which is probably kind of like a justification of Hegel, but not a justification for people who believe that that's good. It's just like, this is just how it operates.
Yeah.
The state thinks it's God, and it's always going to take that place of God. Yeah. So, then that brings us to the question of, it's interesting because you have to allow secularization to happen, because people have to be free to not believe and free to believe and go through a process of losing their faith and finding their faith. And even at the mass scale, you have to risk the entire culture or the entire nation if people to ruin. And this is repeated in the Old Testament over and over and over again, where, like Nineveh in the story of Jonah, like Nineveh fell. It's just, you have to allow that. I mean, what was that? Sodom and Gomorrah, they went a little too far, and God just like said, no more, because he couldn't find a single righteous man. The only righteous man there was Abraham. And so he told Abraham, I can't clean this up, get out of here. But you have to allow for Nineveh to fall. You have to allow for Babylon to fall, in order for the individuals to reclaim or realize faith, and then for grace to then follow faith or lead people to faith and then re-implement itself once people have faith. And so the loss of faith is a part of the process.
I don't think there was a loss of faith. There's a loss of knowledge of what to put faith in, almost by partly by.
You just earned your pay for the day. That was the perfect. That's the clip right there.
But because everyone worships something, and like, because attention is worship. And so where faith comes in is faith that your attention is being oriented towards the correct thing.
Yeah.
Or
in the correct way.
The thing that will allow you to derive meaning from.
Yeah.
And so with respect to secularity and the scientific method, for example, a lot of people have faith in a telos of, let's say, Mana's machine, a telos of infinite progress. And why that requires faith is because the scientific method is inherently circular and self-referential. Like, for example, it is essentially saying something, it is asserting something to be true, relying on a combination of inductive and deductive methods through observation of phenomena that occurred in the past, and using that, right, historical phenomena to justify that statement of fact in the present, but relying on events in the future to confirm the statement that is made in the present. And the reason why it requires an event in the future to confirm its veracity is because the tools we use to describe reality, scientific method, via numbers, are self-referential, because math itself is a good tool for understanding reality in an ontological sense. So math is like, it's as close of a proxy as we can get for a language to describe an ontological for itself, like something in and of itself, for itself, as it exists outside of observation through human subjectivity. Language, on the other hand, is humans describing their subjectivity in a way other humans can approximate. Mm-hmm. Mathematics is the opposite, or we think it's the opposite, but we can't actually, because we can't understand an ontological nature of a thing through our own observations, we can't actually prove that math as a language gets at the ontological thing in and of itself. And so we just have to trust that at some point in the future, we defer to the future, that our assessments of reality based on mathematics, based on Bernoullian statistics, based on Bayesian statistics, will be accurate, and our statements made about our observations via math are accurate right now. And so we're hoping in the future we'll be able to prove math with math, or prove math via some other means. And that element of infinite deferral to basically verify what we currently believe about the present is that element of faith, because it's infinite deferral. You just believe that.
It's outside of yourself. It's beyond
Yeah.
yourself. It's greater than you. Yeah.
Yep.
And so that is obscured somehow in a secular society.
Well, no, in a secular society, the faith element is that you believe the science, it becomes the science. Fauci, the science is basically the transmutation of that statement in the present into almost a divine revelation.
Yeah.
It's turning that approximation for truth into a divinely revealed truth.
Yeah.
Because in order for you to say this is the truth, you would have to be able to see into the future, which makes you, right, omnitemporal. It renders you almost like this divine.
Yeah.
It renders the self as divine. And part of that is a really, really, really bad public education, especially with respect to what science is and what it can tell us and what it is capable of discerning epistemically, but also what the nature of these theories that we're putting together are. And in my engineering courses, I had a professor once say this statement about mechanical models, and I blew my mind. I thought it was genius. He said, all models are wrong, some models are useful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if all models are wrong, who are you to be saying the science? I am the science. That's a faith statement.
You said that's a product of bad education, but it's not a product of bad education if that's what education has been purposed to.
Well, at that level, it's hubris, and it's being a, I guess, instrumentalist, because he's probably, I don't know, you'd be shocked at the number of MDs who use really bad statistical analysis and don't understand calculus. Like, there's been a couple jokes about these MDs basically calculating the area under a curve, and then writing a paper about how they developed this new method for calculating the area under the curve. And it's like, oh, congrats, you discovered calculus. That type of, because a lot of people really medical schools don't concretely require Calc 1 and Calc 2. I'm sure Fauci is, like, 'cause he's old, so he probably had to take Calc 1 and Calc 2. But you'd be surprised about a lot of what is happening is actually just stupidity and not malfeasance.
Well, we still have to hold somebody accountable, right? I mean, if you claim to be God and you turn out not to be, there's got to be a punishment for that, right? If you claim to be the science and you turn out to be wrong, then either science is at stake and you have to sacrifice yourself on the stake of science if that's what you staked your whole reputation on, somehow.
Well, in a society that believed the divine was transcendent, this wouldn't be a problem. He'd be tarred and feathered.
Yeah,
but
or decapitated.
Well, we live in a society where we think that is possible. We think man can be God-man.
Yeah.
So, he's just doing what I aspire to do, be God-man.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the system will fail to correct that because everybody in the system kind of believes
that's aspirational. That's becoming the Ubermensch.
Mm-hmm. So where are you headed now? You're done with school now, or are you going on to another school thing? And I'm wondering that in the context of your writing and your interaction and how you are promulgating your plot art.
I'm taking the bar this summer, and I start my job in the fall.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is like full. You're full time for the foreseeable
future. I'm free.
Yeah.
It's been a long, long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any vacations that you're going to treat yourself with? You're going to go to Disney World, check out their awesome woke rides?
No, I'm kind of a hermit.
Really?
Ever since the pandemic, yeah, I've developed, I'm
Oh
not
no, hermitude.
agoraphobe, but
Oh
yeah,
no.
I like
Okay.
to stand and read and argue.
Well, this is the problem, though, with Orthodox Christianity. I don't think there are any matriarchs per se. I mean, aren't they? Aren't you going to be pulled into fulfilling your womanly
Well,
destiny?
I mean,
Not to
so that's actually
embark on the
not, I
gender.
mean, there's nuns and
Oh, that's
moms,
true. I'm sorry. You know what?
but
You're right. Are you
I don't
none?
necessarily plan on becoming a nun, no.
No. Okay.
Um, that's kind of, it's also what I kind of like about Orthodoxy is it doesn't, like, there's rules, but it's not like you being an Orthodox Christian doesn't look any one specific set way. Like, oh, just because you're an Orthodox Christian doesn't mean you can't
Yeah, it's
argue
not
on the
like being
internet.
Amish. Are you on
Yeah.
the internet? Huh.
I
And
mean,
that's
go
what.
there's lots of them on there. Go the Ortho Bros. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. Is that your aspiration though? I'm just wondering, are you
Mhm.
because you are so phenomenally intelligent and connected to something, and your position in history is really important. I just wonder, I guess you're just focusing on your career. Do you have any aspirations to put your knowledge, your working knowledge of what's going on into a formalized, book or
I've been
series of
asked,
lectures?
and I might. I think
Yeah.
I'll probably look into that more after I finish.
Yeah.
Take the bar and hopefully pass.
Take the bar.
This
Yeah.
summer. But
Is there a kind of law that you want to practice, or is that off
oh yeah,
limits for the
I'm doing patent
discussion?
prosecution.
Patent prosecution.
Yeah, which means I don't go to court. I file patent applications.
Oh, okay. That's easy. So you're
Yeah,
just
so
kind
I
of
don't
like
have to
a,
interact with people except for
yeah.
maybe I only have to do a couple of inventor interviews and then because
Huh.
I did a dual JD,
Yeah.
Master by Medical Engineering. Um, so I can do that. I'm I'll probably have to be in office for like the first year or two, but you can be a patent prosecutor from home, which is probably why I did it because that's fun. And I hate commutes or
Well,
and
yeah.
leaving.
Yeah. Did you suffer any consequences physically for that accident?
No, I was no, not like I like my airbag didn't go off. I just like lurched forward and I was like really
Wow.
like right after I got out of my final.
Hmm.
Of
Wow.
course it is. Yeah, I was just like more annoyed than anything.
Yeah.
But
But grace.
yeah.
Hmm.
Another thing happened the other day that I thought was really weird. Um, I was driving to Walmart and like I was going a different way and I pulled out of my apartment complex. And I looked over and there was a street sign that said Shekinah. And it was like the next street over. And I was like, this is because I never before started looking into like this stuff, like Loranic Kabbalah, when Shekinah is a concept of Loranic Kabbalah, I'd never seen that word. And so it's like the next street over. It's a street sign that said Shekinah. And I was kind of spooked out by that because I was like,
Did
it's
you go
probably a
down
sign.
it?
No, no, no.
No?
Um,
From my
but
understanding, the Shekinah is kind of like the like if God had a smell or a perfume, like this kind
well,
of
it's
sweet
in Loranic
glow.
Kabbalah, it's the divine feminine. It's like wisdom. It's like something that you can interact with.
Oh,
Or like,
yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
it's different from the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But it's more so like the concept of that fourth entity in Sophiology.
Okay.
Like it's
Yeah.
like Sophia.
I've because I've read it just as a descriptor for certain just kind of vibrancies that you can perceive when you perceive interact with the divine. You can there's this perfume or this glow, this kind of like this. I think that is called a shroud too, but it is associated with a feminine esque
There's some
aspect of.
really weird because so there's Walter Hanegraaff has books called uh what's it called? It's about basically sex and like the esoteric and
Hmm.
there's some weird stuff with like Shekinah doing some rated R activities
Oh,
with.
like tantric
Is that
kind of stuff.
I don't know much about tantric, but
Okay,
it's
yeah.
like no, it's like an individual, and they're like having
Relations.
one time, which yeah, and it's like where where they take on the opposite sex. Like the individual is like now in this interaction is the opposite sex from what they. It's very
Hmm.
there's some like queer theory vibes, but which is
Hmm.
and I've been planning to look into that more. With respect to like the idea, the concept of like that gender manifestation, that interaction with Shekinah. I'm like, that sounds kind of familiar.
Hmm.
But yeah. And then so I saw that and I was like, I bet this is a sign that I'm reading too much uh Loranic Kabbalah and
Everything in
Degenerate.
moderation, even if you're trying to
Yeah.
critique it. Yeah. Well, right side, alias Hegelborg.
Yeah.
Are you identifying as the Borg or are you identifying the Borg?
It's kind of a running joke where it's like
Yeah.
I'm mocking the Hegelborg
Yeah.
by
You're
kind of
mocking the right side.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for coming on. I'm always enjoying your Twitter fiascos, your hijinks
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff. That's
You
great.
can't
And
stay
you're
out of
doing a lot of,
trouble.
people can find you on there. I do see you interacting with a lot of spaces and stuff. So you
Mm.
are having lots of conversations there. So if
Yeah.
anybody's interested, stumbles cross you on here, then they can definitely hear more of what you think.
And I
And,
started a podcast.
oh,
I'm not super, I post like maybe once every like 2 weeks.
okay.
Called Useless Eaters.
Okay. What are you eating?
So, uh,
Eaters?
well, it's called Useless Eaters,
Yeah.
like the Yuval Noah Harari thing, where it's like the people are useless eaters.
Yeah. Yeah. Consumers. Yeah.
Yeah.
they are, you are the carbon kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. You're
you want,
useless and you eat too much.
yeah. Yeah. And so what are you exploring with that?
I do like queer theory. I do Loranic Kabbalah. I do
Hmm.
some more like Marxist theory stuff. I go into like
Analysis. Yeah.
Brodsky, yeah, and I talk about Walter Benjamin. I talk about Gershom Scholem, some Karl Popper, some like more science, like kind of epistemic stuff. Kurt
Yeah.
Gödel, all that
Yeah. It'd be fun to
funness.
hear you and Logan Lansing interact. Maybe if you guys don't do that
Hmm.
on your own, I'll have to rope you guys both into a conversation.
Yeah, I like that. I like his. I like that book a lot.
Yeah.
Um, The Queering of the American.
Child.
What was it?
Yeah.
Queering the American Mind or
Kid
Classroom?
or child. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, yeah. Or classroom, maybe. But it's all the same thing.
Hmm.
Right.
But thanks for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I'm going to end the recording. And that's good. That's the show. Thanks.